I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and other Treaty 7 peoples, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Peoples, which includes Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. We're also home here in Calgary to Métis Nation of Southern Alberta, Region 3. And for those of you who don't know, we at the University of Calgary and in the Faculty of Arts are committed to joining with our Indigenous friends and neighbors in a good way in a path towards reconciliation. I would encourage you to look at Iltipitope, which is the University of Calgary's Indigenous strategy, which is very much guiding us in all the faculties at the University of Calgary, and we're working closely with our communities and leaders in various of these communities, and I know that we're all committed to reconciliation and to moving forward in a good way on the journey and the path that we share. The University of Calgary has for some time now had what we call our Eyes High strategic plan, and the Eyes High talks about being a top research university in Canada, being an innovator in teaching and learning, and being increasingly connected to the communities that we both lead and serve. What we've got here in humanities and the Institute for Humanities is just a wonderful gem, a signature piece of what we do at the University of Calgary. This is a research center that strives for excellence in humanities research. It supports researchers here. It brings researchers from elsewhere, houses postdocs. It's a real hub of intellectual research activity. And it's also connected to our teaching mission. And more than that, the reach out to the community is something that you just don't see in all research centers and facilities at major research universities. That the room is so full is, I think, an indication of that. And in fact, just before we started, I was thinking, I'm sorry to have to interrupt all the buzz of intellectual fervor that was going on already at each of your tables. I could just, the room was vibrating. And I know that the humanities community events are known for that. And one of the reasons that they are so popular is that you can come here and really engage in important work. So, kudos to everyone at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. Thanks so much for the generous support that we receive from individuals, both of their time and their treasure. The Calgary Institute of the Humanities has a really, really strong group of advisors, community members who give of their time, give of their efforts to make this such a wonderful institute. The other thing I've always liked about the Institute of the Humanities here at the University of Calgary is that it takes, I think, a very nice and generously broad and inclusive view of what are the humanities. Sometimes when we talk about the humanities, you can end up with a really narrow number of disciplines, and that's what the humanities is all about. Well, at the University of Calgary, that's not how we see it, and that's certainly not how our advisory group and those who participate in these events see the humanities. Yes, there's a particular perspective that humanities researchers bring, but those humanities researchers can come from disciplines that you would normally regard as social sciences or fine arts, or even the sciences, not just from the traditional humanities disciplines. But what they share is this perspective on trying to understand the human condition and be able to focus their intellectual work on what it means to be human in this world, what it means to engage in with the human-created environment as well as the natural environment. And we've had some wonderful community events over the last years that have looked at a variety of dimensions. And look at the one that has been chosen for today, the cultural politics of DNA. I mean, it just it could cover almost anything, and it's just so fascinating. I know that where you're going to hear about Elizabeth Warren. I know that that's been picked out as one of the interesting examples that brings forward questions of ethics and politics and regulation and what does it mean? What is your identity defined by your DNA? These are really important questions. We were talking at a lunch just a few days ago with some of the individuals who are really interested in DNA, and I know I've started. I was raising the issues around the DNA database that has been created in the country of Iceland, and I was thinking of it because I'm going to Iceland this summer, and I have relatives and I have some colleagues and collaborators at the University of Iceland, and so some of you may not know, but about 40% of the population of Iceland is in a database of DNA, and Icelanders are wonderful genealogical obsessives, and so there's a historical database, so you can trace people back about 1,000 years, really from the creation of Iceland in 900. People have kept records, and so when you combine that with a data bank of DNA, where people have contributed their DNA, it's wonderful for researchers. But it also opens up huge ethical concerns and issues. One of them being that there's a private company in collaboration with the government that is getting the DNA and storing it, decode. Well, what does that all mean? And if you find things from someone's DNA, should you then be informing them that they might be at risk for cancer, or their children might be at risk for autism? When do you inform them? So I know that these ethical dimensions are going to come up, and your table questions are fascinating, and I wish I could stay and be part of it. I will stay for the first session, and I know that all of you will contribute to making this a wonderful, wonderful event. And again, I thank you all for coming. I thank the organizers, and I know that we're all looking forward to a wonderful day here talking about such a fascinating issue. So with that, I'd like to turn to ask one of our CIH Advisory Council members, Rod Wade, to come up and say a few words. And he's another, I think, sterling example of science and humanities all coming together in an individual with an enormous intellectual curiosity. Rod Wade is a retired petroleum engineer. He has a Master of Engineering degree from the University of Calgary. So he's a proud alum of our university. And he worked as a petroleum engineer for 35 years, working in technical and managerial capacities for BP and Talisman Energy, both here in Canada and internationally. But Rod has always had an abiding interest in the humanities, an abiding interest in ethics. And so more recently, in 2013 actually, Rod completed a BA in Religious Studies and Applied Ethics. And he has been a tremendous volunteer for the Calgary Institute of Humanities, serving for many years now on the CIH Advisory Council. So it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Rod Wade.
Good morning, and thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. As a U of C alumnus, I've been asked by the U of C Alumni organization as a sponsor of this forum to welcome my fellow U of C alumni. I understand that about a quarter of you folks in this room are U of C alumni. My involvement with the University of Calgary as an alumni, Richard alluded to, it started after I graduated in 2013 with that Bachelor of Arts degree. And at that time, I joined the advisory council and have been a member now for 6 years. For me, the Institute has provided me an opportunity to slake my curiosity, to learn just for the joy of learning through the lectures, forums that the Institute sponsors, and that the Institute makes me aware of through the broader University of Calgary in general. One of my favorite silly little stories to illustrate the tortuous path curiosity took me recently with the Institute and the University of Calgary is as follows. I attended an esoteric lecture last year sponsored by the Institute called What Color Was the Green Night?, which was about a pre-Chaucerian Middle English manuscript that I'd never heard of before. Incredibly, we don't study medieval manuscripts in engineering. A few weeks later, I attended a University of Calgary lecture that was sponsored by the Graduate College, and it was called Manufacturing Meaning, Medieval and Modern Material Sustainability, which, being an engineer, caught my notice and intrigued me. Well, to my surprise, the lecturer and the lecturer referenced this same medieval document, the Green Knight, as a source of information for building sustainability. And I thought, wow, that's really something. And then a few weeks later, or a few months later, it doesn't matter, I was reading an article on grammar, of all things, and split infinitives. It's true, split infinitives. And in that document, you guessed it, was a reference to this Green Knight medieval manuscript that had within it, in the view of the journalist who was writing the article, a justifiable use of split infinitives. Just a silly little story about how you can ping pong through something you never heard of, and this. On a more practical level, I, as many, I suspect you do as well in this room, I believe that humanities is so much to offer, but indeed humanities are indispensable to effectively tackle real and pressing challenges in the world. As you know, I'm an engineer. And what is an engineer? An engineer is an applied scientist. And what is my Bachelor of Arts degree in? Religious studies and applied ethics. Consistent with the belief that humanities are indispensable to effectively tackle the challenges that we have in the present age, my wife and I recently decided to initiate an applied ethics full course equivalent ongoing fellowship and lecture series under the auspices of the Institute. It is Thank you, I appreciate that. It is the intent of this new fellowship and lecture series to bring to the public helpful insight to current and pressing ethical questions, might hear one or two of them today, that we collectively and individually are wrestling with. Hopefully an applied ethics lecture will come to a lecture theater, of course, near you in the next year or so. Because if it does, it means that the Institute is continuing to successfully fulfill its mandate as a bridge between the university and the community, as it is with this annual community forum, for example. Another organization that is meant to bridge between the university and the community is the U of C Alumni. It does so by supporting forums like this, for example. And you, my fellow alumni, you also have a potential role to bridge between the university and the community, perhaps via the conduit of the U of C alumni, and thereby slaking your curiosity as well in the process. Thank you all for your kind attention, and to all attendees, enjoy being challenged today by the speakers who will help us bridge the science of DNA with the cultural, political impact of DNA. Enjoy.
Well, thanks very much, Rod, and thanks to Dean Sigurdsson for coming and for the support of the Faculty of Arts, and of course thanks to Rod for the greetings on behalf of alumni, but for your generous support of the Institute over the years, and especially this fantastic new initiative in applied ethics. So this is actually the CIH's 39th annual community seminar. We are Canada's oldest humanities institute. We've been 43 years now. At the U of C. And over the years, this particular seminar has tackled a wide range of issues, often with a certain amount of prescience, it has to be said. In the 1980s, we looked at the ethics of what was then called the greenhouse effect. In the 90s, we looked at what was then called the information highway. Another seminar from the 90s dealt with the dilemmas of reconciliation. What joins all of these seminars is a concern with the human dimensions of social issues. The humanities, as Richard points out, comprises those disciplines that use textual analysis to understand what it means to be human. So typically, the humanities then are English, history, religious studies, philosophy, art, and so on. But at the CIH, as Richard said, we've always taken a much broader approach, and we're very much interested in topics like the history and philosophy of science, which we'll be talking about today, or applied ethics, which Rod mentioned, which is also clearly a part of this, environmental ethics, medical humanities, and so on. Most of all, at the Institute, we affirm the value of civic discourse and civil conversation. And in that regard, this event has always been our flagship event. But over the course of the year, we also have a series of talks to which the public is very much invited. This year's talks have included such things as the social benefits of space exploration, reading and radicalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the history of proportional representation in Western Canada, surveillance in 20th century Canadian art, energy nationalism, and the Mexican oil appropriation of the 1930s. These lectures are given by our research fellows and by visiting speakers, and it's the generosity, in fact, of our donors like Rod that have allowed us to add 2 new research fellows this year, and who have also supported 8 different interdisciplinary working groups. And so I would like to very much thank all of those who have contributed to our ongoing endowment campaign. It's made a huge difference to the CIH, and I think that makes a huge difference to the Calgary community. So thank you. Now, the topic for our community seminar today was chosen by our advisory council, which is made up of community members like you, and some of them you'll meet today acting as table facilitators for the conversations at lunch. Typically, the way this goes, the way the year goes, is we start identifying possible topics in the summer. So, like next week. We narrow it down in the fall, start investigating speakers, inviting them. And what we try for typically is to get a really diverse perspective on a particular topic. Now, next year's topic is going to be our 40th, so it needs to be special. So if you have ideas, do send them in. Now, coincidentally, about a month ago, a day after the final planning session for this seminar, I got a call from my younger sister, Jennifer. Oops. She's not there yet. There she is. Okay. So Jennifer had heard from my mother, who had heard from my Aunt Audrey. Is my mother going to show up? Okay, that's my mother. Okay, there's my Aunt Audrey. That my cousin Lindee had gotten the results back from a DNA ancestry test. Now, we all suspected she had done it to find if she had any unknown brothers and sisters, because her father was like that. But it turned out that she discovered a cousin living in the States who was older than all of us. Is he going to show up? I'm pointing probably in the wrong direction. There we are. So Linda called my Aunt Audrey to see what she knew. And Audrey told her a closely held family secret, that another aunt, Joyce, had gotten pregnant as a teenager, and they sent her from her home in Bathurst, New Brunswick, to have the baby in Toronto, and it was given up for adoption. Now, this was the 1950s in New Brunswick, so this isn't exactly an unusual story. But she came back, trained as a secretary. This is Joyce, moved to Montreal, married somebody who was quite well off. They lived in a very nice house in Mount Royal. And as a child, she came off to the rest of the family as a terribly snobbish woman who was ashamed of her New Brunswick relatives. And I think that this secret begins to explain, perhaps, and give a poignant twist to that particular story. Now, it's not unusual for these tests to turn up unknown relations and to uncover family secrets. And of course, it's not new for adopted children and their biological family to find each other. But what is new now is how these possible reunions come about. In the past, it would have been at the initiation of the child or the birth mother. Here it has come out completely accidentally with somebody with no solid connection really to the story. And the story for me demonstrates the truth of a recent article in the New York Times that says, particularly if you're a North American of European descent, you don't need to have your DNA tested anymore. You're already traceable in the DNA banks. And we're seeing that especially now in cold cases that are solved by the DNA of somebody that's close to the perpetrator. Now, in my case, the revelation of the family secret came with a series of ethical quandaries. My Aunt Joyce, the woman in question, now suffers from dementia. So she cannot be asked whether she would like to meet her biological son, nor would she likely benefit from or even understand such a meeting. The quandary for my sisters and my aunts has become, should her daughter Anne know? Should somebody tell her that the rest of the family now knows this secret? It's possible, of course, that Anne does know, but we don't know that. Now, another kind of DNA twisting gives another kind of DNA testing gives a different, whoops, we're gone. Oh no, they're all evaporating. So my father and his brother Don, Linda's father, there's Don, there's Ross, my father, suffered from the same kind of dementia, something called Lewy body syndrome. Their mother, Ada Lucy, also had dementia, and of course, Joyce has dementia. So there seems to be a very strong genetic predisposition in this family to a particular form of disease. Does Joyce's biological son have the right to know that medical history, should such a test surface? And from here we get to the increasingly common perception that DNA is destiny, that our genes determine not just the physical features of our body, but also our identity and possibly our fate. So the DNA test doesn't just tell our past, it tells our future. And knowing about one's genetic makeup could possibly impinge upon the ethics of our future decisions. Should I have children? Should I have preemptive surgery? Should I worry about my RRSPs anymore? Should I invest in a clone? All sorts of things like that. So the idea that DNA is destiny, of course, is more true in the Western world, in the developed world, where our mortality is less affected by poverty, war, disease, and environmental degradation than it is in the global South, for example. DNA is clearly not everyone's destiny. But more broadly, the discovery of DNA and its role in determining our body's physical makeup has, of course, shifted in the past century. Our understanding of identity, race, and belonging, of the knowability of our past and the predictability of our future. The Homeric dictum that it's a wise child that knows its own father is no longer true. It's a child with a cheap DNA kit that knows its father. So today's seminar will engage with some of these questions and some of the questions, of course, that unfold from them. with how our faith in the revelatory power of science has crowded out other ways of thinking, how the promise of DNA has colonized our imagination with fantasies of living forever, or alternatively, having our future stolen by a clone. So once again, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the CIH to today's seminar, and I hope that all of our DNA revelations will be fruitful ones. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jim Brown, who's going to be the moderator for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Jim. I just have one question for you, though. You piqued my curiosity there. The lecture, The History of Proportional Representation in Western Canada, how long was it?
The lecture or
Yeah, the lecture. It seems to me that would be an extremely short lecture. About that long, I think. I was really pleased when Jim asked me to do this today because this was a subject that interested me very much. We did a piece. I used to host a radio show called The 180, and we did a piece about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago called That DNA Test Doesn't Make You Indigenous. And this isn't quite as ornate a quilt as Rod spun with his link of stories. But in that story, one of our speakers today, Kim TallBear, appeared. And also Professor Nelson from Columbia, who another one of our speakers today is going to refer to in her talk. So there are links there, and it's a subject of deep interest to me, and I hope you'll find today's series of talks and conversations with you of interest to you. So let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Susan Lindee. She is the Janice and Julian Bers Professor of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of Moments of Truth in Genetic Medicine and the DNA Mystique, the Gene as Cultural Icon. A distinguished historian of science, Dr. Lindee has special interests in the history of genetics, gender and science, science and popular culture, and science and war. So please join me in welcoming Susan Lindee.
It's lovely to be here today. You know, one of the things we think as academics is that it's very important to reach out, to communicate across different communities and with people who are not just academics, but in elite academic institutions, but with the public at large. So I welcome opportunities to do this. We live in a time when trust in science is being challenged. There are critics of climate science, of vaccine sciences, and always the enduring criticism of evolution. But there is, thank you. But there is one recent domain, I think I changed my title, but it doesn't matter. Let me see how to, yeah, okay. There's one recent domain where trust in science seems to be expanding in a really dramatic way, and that is genealogy DNA testing. So this is a technical domain which has attracted more consumers, more people in 2017 bought DNA testing. They consumed it for themselves than in all previous years combined. Industry estimates say that about 12 million people today have submitted their DNA to a private company, placed it in those databases. This means that in the United States, about 1 in 25 people have had their DNA tested, which is a very large number. The price of such testing has plummeted. Most of the companies were founded between about 1999 and 2003, and early tests cost as much as about $1,500. Today, you can get a test for $49 on sale, a wide range of testing. So the price has plummeted, the interest has expanded, and also there is a support industry built around genealogy DNA testing to help these consumers make sense of what the DNA tests mean. And this is actually a website that promises to help you make sense of which tests you need and what your testing might mean. About 30 years ago, Dorothy Nelkin and I, the late sociologist of science, wrote a book that we called The DNA Mystique. And what we were interested in at the time is the way that DNA, genes, and heredity appeared in American popular culture. What were the images of DNA, and why did it appear in things like car ads or in perfume boxes? So this was DNA perfume actually had a notice on the box that said, "There's no actual DNA in this bottle." So what did it mean that why did it seem so powerful to marketers to invoke DNA or to suggest that somehow when you bought a car you were getting, it has the Jeep DNA? What were you getting there, or what permanence did it imply? We were also interested in the way that scientists associated with the Human Genome Project promoted DNA. And one of the things we noticed is that DNA appeared in many of these public narratives and also in narratives in, say, fiction, on soap operas, in cartoons, so in broad public culture, was as an immortal soul or a human soul. It contained good and evil. It had the capacity to lead to immortality. It could be used, presumably, just as the soul was used on the day of the resurrection of the dead. That is, the self could be reconstituted. But in addition, we were interested in the practical uses of DNA, in the ways that DNA was invoked in employment decisions, in legal decisions, and in educational protocols, in plans around what would happen to students. So what we were suggesting is that there's a scientific argument, there's a popular image, and there's a practical consequence as these images are applied in institutional settings where people use them to make decisions about individual destiny. Now, much of this promotion came from the HGP. This was from 1990 to 2003. And one of the things that the HGP promised was a cure for basically all disease, but especially that mapping the genome would make it possible to cure what are called common and complex diseases, and that is things like cancer and heart disease, extraordinarily difficult to treat. Would DNA provide a guide for the solution, the resolution of common and complex diseases? It did not, as you may know. So such diseases are still a public health problem all over the world. And indeed, one of the key outcomes of this massive public investment in a technological infrastructure and in a scientific infrastructure was something that I would warrant the early promoters of human genetics in the 1950s and 60s would find utterly astonishing, and that is the promotion of DNA genealogy testing, or of a commercial enterprise built around these technologies. What these technologies do, part of what they do, is they legitimate versions of race that would look familiar to Blumenbach or Morton. That is, that these are historical Enlightenment visions of what race is, where race counts as Europe or Africa or Asia or Native American, so these massive conglomerations of people. People call these kinds they call this testing genotainment. They promise connection of various kinds, so they promise connections to your past, learn about yourself, who are you, and I think Jim's comments about how this tells you who, your destiny, so to speak, it's a part of this, what these testing companies are marketing is identity, your future, your destiny, and I'm going to turn to, so it's sort of kinship for sale. And what I want to persuade you of at this moment is that kinship is one of the most important social and cultural categories in any society. So kinship is a crucial social system. It has been studied by social scientists, by anthropologists and sociologists for more than a century. It has been understood as crucial to understanding any society. You have to figure out how kinship works. And how is identity and personhood understood, who is recognized as kin, who counts as kin. So remember, even in Western society, it's not strictly a matter of blood, although blood is a common way of describing kin relations. If we think of illegitimate children, they don't count as part of kin. They're not inside the family network. And indeed, there are other systems where blood is invoked, but it does not mean the same thing that it might mean to us. So it's not automatically blood, and kin can also be determined by things like dreams. by signs, by shared experiences. So how is kin known? How do you know that someone is your kin? And what are your obligations to kin? These are culturally, temporally specific. They vary across the world. They vary across time. Smaller, isolated groups have perhaps been more studied in these kinship questions than mass industrial society. But what I want to suggest is that whatever kinship means, whatever it looks like in any society, is very important for understanding human experience. It reveals the structure of the social order. It tells you how relations are understood, and relations are central to human life and human identity. The anthropologist Paul Rabineau in 1996 coined the term biosociality, and I'm just going to invoke it a little bit. It is much invoked in these analyses. And what Rabineau was partly responding to the promotion of the Human Genome Project and to sociobiology, so he was twisting the term around. And he predicted that genome mapping and access to DNA would produce new forms of kinship grounded in shared alleles. So this would involve what he called modes of voluntary subjectification. That means the bringing of oneself into these networks in a voluntary way, perhaps as a consumer, in which individuals work on themselves under certain forms of authority, in this case the authority of science, in relation to truth discourses, claims that DNA can tell you who you really are, means of practices of the self, and in the name of their own life or health, that of their family, or some other collectivity. And so Rabineau, what I use him to introduce the idea that it's not the biology that gives these social practices their power. And so I want to kind of lead you in that direction. It's not the biology that matters here. Now, in order to persuade you of this, I'm going to give you a quick summary of how ancestry databases are produced. As you may know, there are 7 billion people on the planet. And as you may know, there are many, I have done these ancestry by DNA testing too, and I've even been told the exact city in Austria from which my ancestors came. So that's pretty specific. And so 23andMe, which is one of the ancestry DNA testing companies, produced a white paper describing how they figure out exactly what ancestry line you come from, and I'm going to quickly describe it. There are 7 billion people in the world. 23andMe uses DNA from 10,699 people, and about 9,000 of those are customers of 23andMe who have agreed to be interviewed or to submit data about their own heritage to the company. The others come from HapMap and Ceph and other biorepositories where DNA samples are stored, which were collected historically. So all of the samples in this 10,699 people involve self-reported ancestry. Customers are asked, where were your grandparents born? And if all 4 grandparents were born in the same country, then that individual is seen as potentially relevant to that country's mix of alleles, frequency of alleles. Participants are also asked about other ethnic data, and the 3 examples given in the white paper are Ashkenazi, Basque, and Cherokee. This is a Basque demonstration in favor of the Basque language. So in an important way, informants tell geneticists their own kinship. They tell geneticists their stories, their origin stories, what they know about their backgrounds. And these origin stories are then built into the data. So what do people report about their own families? One thing that's crystal clear, and I think even Jim's comments suggested this, we don't always know that much about our own family. So there are a lot of mysteries and secrets in this DNA. But this information becomes a part of this. And one thing I want to mention too is that after the voyages of discovery, certainly after 1500, there's nothing more common than people moving around the world, and wherever people come in contact, they seem to produce DNA relationships, okay? Everywhere that explorers went, people migrated. It's an extremely mobile world, at least for the last 600 years, and so, or more than 500 years. And so how would, having been born in Brazil, if all 4 of your parents were born in Brazil, it is entirely possible that they would have origins, ancestral origins, from many other places around the world. So having been born in Brazil is not proof of anything. There's also the fact that the frequencies of alleles, all ancestral DNA is based on the idea that certain frequencies of some alleles are more common in given geographical locations. But the problem is that the only way to count frequencies is to count them in living human populations, and living human populations may or may not have the same frequencies of those alleles as existed, say, 1,000 years ago. So we know from evolutionary studies that allele frequencies can shift very quickly in birds and other organisms. Why can't they shift quickly in human populations? So how do you know that the presence of that allele was the same, that the frequency was the same in the historical past compared to what it is today? So in any living individual, the presence of an allele may be suggestive, but it's not definitive. That's kind of the point here. And finally, I'll turn to the numbers. If you go back 40 generations, you have over 2 trillion ancestors. So you have quite a few, which should mean that you have ancestors from everywhere, as far as I can tell, because I don't know when there were 2 trillion people on the planet. And using 30 years as an average, it very quickly gets up to, by 2,048 ancestors in 1620, you don't share a lot of your DNA with any of these ancestors, none of them. So ancestral testing of DNA is, the point here is that this is not about biology. It might be meaningful to people, but it is not a meaningful biological connection. In near genealogy, the connections are rather different, and there's a possibility of rupture in kinship. The man pictured here is Brian Sykes. He is an Oxford University geneticist, and in 2000 he published a paper in which he had tracked the relationship between the Sykes surname in Britain and the Y chromosome DNA. And his goal was to find out if surname and Y chromosome matched. What he concluded, having done a fairly careful analysis of this family, this name line, was that non-paternity events were pretty common, and the surname and the Y chromosome did not match. And there could be many different reasons for that. It could include adoption. People can have the name and not have the Y chromosome. As a result, he coined the term in a 2000 scientific paper in PE for non-paternity event. That's what he was referring to. And other geneticists began to study surnames and Y chromosome lines in men to try to figure out how much difference was there between the name and the Y chromosome. NPE today has a slightly different meaning. It means not parent expected. So the acronym has changed because many different kinds of unexpected relationships have been revealed as a result of this DNA testing. And NPE Friends is a Facebook group. It's a private, closed Facebook group. I take this quote from the invitation to join if you've discovered that you have an NPE, and they say maybe you found out your mom isn't your biological mom, or you have a sister or brother you never knew about. For some of us, it's exciting news, but for others, it's scary and devastating. Either way, let's talk about it and try to work it out with ourselves and our loved ones. So it can be a welcome event, it can be a challenging event, but it certainly suggests that in these networks, kinship is understood as defined by DNA, not necessarily by social relations, not by knowledge, not by affective obligations. So this is a series of quotes from interviews in Atlantic Magazine last year, and I'm not going to read them all, but the title of the story is When a DNA Test Shatters Your Identity. And all of these participants in this debate are describing their distress at learning that their mother or their father was not their biological mother or father, and how they responded to it, how their friends responded. One said that the discovery that his mother's sisters were not his biological aunts caused him to feel less close to them. So what does biology mean to someone who's known the aunts all his life? He feels less close. It has an impact on emotional, on relation, on connection, on what it means to be close to somebody. It's a very powerful testimony of the force of DNA in the definition of identity and what these DNA tests do. I have another example, and this is somewhat different. This is Mikado-Joseph disease, and here is a case where Rabineau's biosociality is generated by disease, or could be generated by disease. So this is a disease which is very distant. The mutation is very distant. It's 7,000 years ago. It was probably a single mutant in China. And the disease is now found in unrelated populations in 16 different countries. There are those who have this disease, who carry this exact same mutation, do not share language, dress, religion, foods, celebrations in common, but they share a trinucleotide repeat which has devastating neurological consequences, and they are therefore a part, in a way, of a new form of biosociality recognizable only as a result of DNA testing. You can only see this kind of biosociality, and many genetic diseases have generated support groups and family support groups in which those with the same disease describe themselves as having a certain form of kinship, a closeness mediated by the presence of that disease. One of the diseases I worked on in my book on human genetics was familial dysautonomia, and the way that the familial dysautonomia community has brought together families, partly because of the difficulty of treatment and the complexity of treatment. Having that kind of support system is important, but that too is biosociality as it plays out. So what is DNA testing? And I'm going to suggest it is definitely entertainment. So this is a living room art that you can buy, which will have your genome on it. This is musical DNA. Spotify announced last year that it would select musicals for you, lists for you based on your ancestry. You would learn new things. You know, you can see your genes in a whole new light. And there is a growing form of entertainment, which is you sell both your Ancestry DNA kit and a tour package based on whatever the kit says. So it's a combination: tourism, DNA testing, and this one about Ireland. I don't think I have any Irish ancestry, but it sounds lovely. So you'll experience what life was like for your Irish ancestors. So a lot of this is funny and silly, but I want to suggest it's also socially revealing. It's also important. It's a powerful new form of scientific kinship in which many people participate from many different directions. And it reflects a kind of trust in science, although the irony is that this kind of science, especially ancestry science, is one of the least reliable forms of biological data currently in circulation. So I began with the problem of trusting science, and now we have a system of trusting and believing in science, even though kinship may not be the most persuasive form of biological data that we have. Kinship is increasingly understood in Western industrialized nations as validated by biology. So the feeling that one is really Irish can be generated by these tests, and what you always suspected. And this comes up definitely in questions of Native American DNA that I know Kim will address. That is, you feel you were always connected to a given group, and this validates a certain feeling. DNA testing generates forms of relation that bear little resemblance to earlier versions of kinship, but I want to suggest that they're just as cultural and historical as those of, say, 18th century India or 20th century Samoa. So it's not that now we know who our real kin are. That's not what this generates. Rather, that DNA testing is the social and commercial system through which kin are increasingly recognized in technoscientific industrialized society. And that's why it's important to think about it. That's why this kind of symposium is important, because these are not trivial matters. They matter to a lot of people. They play an important social and cultural role. It's not biology is the least of it. This is not about biology. This is about how people feel about their connections to family and the nature of kinship. The last picture is a painting, it's an art installation by Suzanne Anker, who is an artist who deals with these questions of the meaning of DNA and of dancing chromosomes on the wall. Thank you. Okay.
Does it matter which mic I said? I was going to know. after each talk, I'll have a couple of questions for the speaker, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Should I sit or stand? Stand.
Which is more comfortable? Standing? is
It's
fine.
weird if you're sitting somehow.
Ah, okay. Well, how about I stand? So I'm curious if these DNA tests are more about entertainment than biology, and if we're redefining our notion of kinship based on iffy science, is it a kind of a conditional kinship that we're creating here, and what are the ramifications of that when science improves and the kinship we assumed is proven to be not kinship at all?
That's an interesting question. Like, we haven't in practice what happens when people learn that what they think about their DNA relations change. So they discover, for example, that someone who they've taken to be their brother all their lives turns out to be a half-brother. So the DNA relationship has changed. Does the social relationship change? Do the feelings change? Do the connections change? And that one quote from the Atlantic article suggested that in some cases it can. The interesting thing is that anyone would think that shared DNA at the level we're talking about is the core it's the core content of connection. So what you probably may know is that, quite frankly, you all share 99.9% of your DNA with me. So I'm going to be coming to borrow money next week. So in other words, like, what is DNA? The nature of the obligatory, kinship is an obligatory system. To whom do you have debts and obligations? So what happens if if you don't share as much DNA with people that you thought? Maybe it changes because of the seriousness with which people take the DNA relationship. Yeah.
Well, if we've commercialized DNA testing to the degree we have, then how far in the future does it take till we start commercializing some of the responsibilities that uncovers and some of the liabilities that might be dug up as a result of DNA testing?
Well, and there's a way where the liabilities really do matter a lot, and that has to do with sperm donors. And there's a database for numbers associated with different sperm donors, and some sperm donors had as many as, what's the maximum, like 80 or 100 offspring, and those 100 offspring track each other down through these systems, and they have big parties in Denver. So, and then the sperm donor, if the
they can have those parties in Canada now. It doesn't have to be Denver anymore.
They could have it in Denver.
The laws have changed.
The laws have changed.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sperm donor sometimes learns of all of these children, all of these offspring. So the rules for sperm donation, say 30 years ago, promised eternal anonymity, but that's gone. And people can track down sperm donors, and they are tracking them down. And then there are, to some extent, questions of liability, because does the donor have any obligations? Does the donor have the obligations of kin?
But at least in those cases, you're dealing with one or two generations or an immediate generation.
Immediate generation.
You can make some scientifically verifiable claims.
Yes.
If you're talking about, ancestral groups and pools of people and
Yes.
distant relatives that may not even be relatives at all, based on the quality of the science that you're using.
Right.
What kinds of questions does that raise in terms of responsibility and liability?
Yes, it's not clear what obligations distant genealogy imposes. And if any of you are hobbyist genealogists, my brother is quite a fan of genealogy. You know that some of the birth certificates, some of the wedding records, they're not right. Some people disappear from genealogy they disappear from the family line for various reasons. Some sides of the family are not included. So genealogy, even the textual record of genealogy, is not a perfect record. It's flawed, it's incomplete. To make a claim based on DNA that you should benefit in some way, and the most common obligation of kin is to borrow money, that's why I use that image, but to make a claim that you have a right to financial access of some kind associated with a particular group, I don't think that would be supportable, even if the DNA tests were correct. Mm-hmm. So the question is, you know, you're saying, what if all the DNA tests are wrong? And I would suggest they're not powerful biologically even today for ancestry testing. It's not a powerful form of biology. It's a very powerful commercial and social system. It has meaning because of the promotion of DNA and because these tests are widely available, and it has a parlor game quality. So I went on 23andMe last week, and I had 45 pages of DNA relatives. And I knew a couple of the ones at the very top, like my cousin and stuff, but the rest of them, I don't know any of them. I don't have, and there are full names and percent of shared DNA for 45 pages. So I have a lot of relatives now. What is that? Is that important? It's not important biologically. Is it important to me personally? Not particularly, but could it be? Mm-hmm. It could be.
You also get situations where society is trying to make recompense for something that's happened in the past, and they
Exactly.
have identified a certain group of people
And
who would
who
qualify
should
for
get,
exactly.
who should get reparations?
Yeah.
Would financial reparations be appropriate in cases of ancestry DNA? Mm-hmm. And as you note, in very near genealogy, it might be relevant. That is, geneticists say about the last 5 generations, you've got something reasonably important to track. In distant genealogy, I don't know. Maybe Kim will tell us about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.